Good afternoon. I'm Mike Van Dusen, Executive Vice President of the Center. I just want a hearty welcome to all of you to being here. A hot topic brings a good audience, and we thank you for being here, and a special thank to all of our panelists for taking time to be here. And it's a real pleasure to introduce Dr. Andrew Selee, Vice President for Programs, soon to be Executive Vice President of the Center. And we are delighted to showcase his book. Andrew will talk for a few minutes, and then there'll be discussion among the panelists, and then I'll open it up to all of you. But thank you for coming, and you're welcome at the Wilson Center anytime. Andrew.
Thank you, Mike.
Yep.
Well, thank you everyone for coming. It's great to have you here. Excuse the husky voice, by the way. This is the getting over a small cold. I want to thank our panelists for being here. We have an extraordinary group here today. Anne-Marie Slaughter, I should say. I mean, not only is the President and CEO of the New America Foundation, but most recently was Director of Policy Planning, has been the Dean of the Woodrow Wilson School, and for all of us that have been reading her for years, is one of those people who combines both depth of analysis and depth of research with an ability to really put things out in the public sphere. And whether she's talking about the New World Order or about women and work, which, or anyone who read her Atlantic article, I mean, really combines, and I'm sure it's one of the issues we'll touch on today, this ability to move between academic research but also public ideas and get things out there. Jim McGann, I think you all know, has really pioneered the field of studying think tanks and really brings a broad global view on what think tanks do, has written many of the best books on think tanks, has studied things from their role in social policy and economic policy to the globalization of think tanks to how they influence the U.S. public policy system, and he runs the Think Tank and Civil Societies program at the University of Pennsylvania. Steve Bennett is the Chief Operating Officer at Brookings, the largest and oldest think tank in the United States. And Brookings is an institution that could easily, like large think tanks tend to do, could easily coast on its reputation, or often do, coast on reputation, coast on the fact that it has good funding, it's well known, and people like what it does. But Steve and his colleagues have really taken Brookings through a process of thinking how to be more strategic, how to position itself constantly for new challenges, and I'm sure he'll talk about that. But I think it's a real challenge to do when you have a large and already well-respected institution. And Lawrence McDonald, who had a huge influence on this book early on, Lawrence is the Vice President for Communications and Policy Outreach for the Center for Global Development, which is an organization that really has been one of the most strategic, has come up in the past 15 years, 2001, 2002?
We're 12 years old.
12 years old. 12 years old, a relatively new think tank, extremely focused, but has really had an incredible impact in terms of positioning issues in the development sphere, and as I think he'll probably talk about at some point, is really thinks about projects starting at the end first, which is one of the theses of this book, actually, and it was something that I learned a lot from the colleagues at CGD, which is really how do you begin with the ending. I'll come back to that in a second. Let me say a few words about the book itself, and then we'll really go into the panel immediately, which is the interesting part of today. This book sprung up initially as a side project working here at the Wilson Center's Mexico Institute. We had a board, the Mexico Institute, that meets every 6 months, and they were constantly asking about impact. What is the impact of what we do? Which is a great question. And so over time, started looking at this more systematically, started reading some of the literature on this, trying to connect the business and nonprofit literature to what we were doing, started to talk to some colleagues about this and learn what I could learn, and did eventually what, wonks do, which is decided it would be a good book, right? And thought of it, really in the format of one of those books that you pick up at the airport. These thin little books that you can read on the plane in about 2 hours, and you actually get something out of not a complex book, not something that was overwrought or had a lot of theory, but would at least think through some of the strategic challenges that we deal with as think tank professionals. I also call it a self-help guide for think tank professionals. So it has a bit of a self-help angle. But the idea is actually, it starts off with the premise that think tanks matter. We'll talk about this in a second. The idea that think tanks contribute both to practical policy ideas, but also the larger public debate, the dialogue of democracy, that there are special reasons why these organizations are important. And it suggests that think tanks that are successful and think tank programs that are successful, and it's useful to think in those two dimensions. Think tanks, particularly large think tanks, are often important in and of themselves, but you also have to disaggregate them into the smaller things they do, into centers, into programs, initiatives, right, where a lot of the life of the organization takes place. The more strategic they are, the more impact they're likely to have. And I talk about 5 things in this book. And this really came from talking to colleagues at other organizations. I'll run through them very quickly, and then we'll go into the discussion. First is knowing what their mission and goals is. Knowing what the mission is and the broad goal, the thing you would love to achieve in an aspirational way, but also thinking in terms of specific goals. And this actually came out of a conversation with Lawrence and some of his colleagues early on, the notion of really starting with the ending. If you're wildly successful at what you want to do, what would it look like? And then build back from that, beginning to think at the end of the project, what it is you want to achieve, knowing that in the policy world, nothing you start out to achieve will ever look exactly like that. But having a roadmap at the beginning often helps you to know if you've gotten there when you get to the end and be able to evaluate what you did in terms of concrete goals. The second thing we talk about is what you do best, finding your unique place, your unique lanes as an organization. And each organization, and often programs within an organization, have different unique strengths. And so thinking through what are those unique strengths that organizations have and what makes them different from others. And we can talk about that more during this discussion. The third thing is thinking about audiences and how you reach them. And this is something in the business world people take for granted, audience segmentation, right? But quite often at think tanks, I think we tend to write something down and send it out to the world and hope people read it, right? Or we convene a meeting, we invite everyone on our mailing list, and we hope the right people get in the room. And so part of the question is how do you begin to actually think of the different audiences that you have and the different techniques for reaching them? And some of the think tanks, I think some of our colleagues at think tanks are doing very exciting things. To do this, it's very labor intensive. And new technologies have both made it more possible to do this, but also much harder because there are many different kinds of things that you need to do to be effective. And so how you combine new technologies and old sort of pounding the pavement and old techniques is part of the question in this. 4 is obviously resources. And let me just say that's probably the issue that many of us spend most of our time worrying about, right? But it's financial resources clearly, but it's also human resources. Who's the intellectual capital of these organizations? Who's the larger human capital? People in communications, people in development, people in administration, people that you need to keep these organizations going, keep them fresh, and keep them moving forward. It's reputation. Reputation is an asset that's incredibly important. And it's also collaborations, how you build synergies with other organizations that make you able to do things that you could never do alone. Both synergies with organizations that are similar and synergies with organizations quite often that are very different. They're sometimes force multipliers. And the final chapter and the final point deals with evaluation and how we learn from experience. And this is a crucial question. This is something that I was talking with a colleague about this earlier today. There are some kinds of organizations that it's very easy to evaluate what they do. You know what your impact is. If you're trying to do a literacy campaign, you can actually quantify that. But in the world of ideas, most of what we do is not quantifiable, right? And so you have to figure out how you have systematic ways of trying to capture impact, both following tangible indicators, but also building in ways of having serious discussions that say, how much impact are we having? Where can we see the imprint of that impact? And how can we build a case that's believable about this, that actually passes the test when you tell it to someone else, to your board, to a funder, to colleagues in the organization? But actually building those processes in systematically is very interesting. And that was actually the hardest chapter to write, much harder than resources, it turned out. But there's some great examples from some of our colleagues at other organizations that were fascinating that have found ways of doing this in very practical ways. So without further ado, let me turn it over to the panel here, and we're going to actually just start the discussion. And let's start off, actually, if we could, let's start off with the question of why these organizations matter. I mean, what is it about think tanks that creates a unique role for them? And if we could start with you, that would be great, and we'll just go around the table.
Great, thank you. So you just have to love Washington. Only in Washington is a slim book called What Do Think Tanks Do? An airplane book. Right? For most of us, it's Danielle Steele, right? I mean,
and only at National Airport at Dulles, I think, right?
Absolutely.
Exactly.
I mean, I'm just sort of thinking about
Two
what your
markets.
normal person picks up when they get on an airplane. And as much as I think it's a great book, and it is, it's not that. So anyway, I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you.
But that said, I, of course, because I am a member of this community, I did read it precisely on a plane between here and LA and marked it up all the way. But let me answer this question not from my current position, at least right now, but rather as a former dean of a public policy school and a former government official, because I think think tanks matter very much from both perspectives. So let me start as the former dean of a public policy school. Time was when people were less specialized and the world, particularly the policy world, was much more elite, that professors moved in and out of government, and the transmission belt between academia and government was pretty open back and forth. And even when I was in law school in Cambridge in the 1980s, people like Joe Nye, they didn't need a Brookings in between Joe Nye and the government for people to know what he thought. That's less and less true. I mean, academia is so much more specialized. I mean, even in my own discipline of international relations, some journals I can read, many I can't, and I'm a professor, or was. So the sort of hyper-specialization of academia and basic research means government officials are never going to read that, even if they could. And think tanks play a critical translation role where they take those, it's like engineering in natural science, where you have the basic research, you have the applied, and then you actually have action. And there, I think the need is greater and greater. And one of the things we all need to be thinking about is translation and connecting back to the academy. Then on the other hand, as a government official, I think there are two critical ways that think tanks are important. So everyone says, you go into government and you have no time to build any intellectual capital. You go in with what you have and you spend it down, and when you're completely out, you leave. So there are two ways there that think tanks are essential. One is to incubate the shadow government, and different think tanks. Brookings certainly does a great deal of that. Some different think tanks vary. New America does very little of that. But, people do have to have a place to go and recharge and learn and engage. And then when they go back into government, they spend that down. So that's one of the key functions. The other is really knowing how to get something into the policy process. So I remember when I was assigned to do the Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review at State, USGLC, the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, had the brilliant idea of doing a report on reports. So they took 20 reports of different think tanks, all on foreign assistance reform and development, and summarized them in 3 or maybe 5 wonderful pages. That was invaluable for me. I mean, they knew how to take all this stuff, distill it. I didn't have time to certainly not the underlying books. I really didn't even have time to read all the way through the reports, but having all that put together was indispensable. And then, of course, I could follow up. So that knowledge of the policy process and when and how to put a thumb on the scale or to get that meeting or to get something in, without that, ideas would not enter the policy process.
Right. Thanks, Anne-Marie. Jim, you've looked at this at a global level. Tell us, what have you learned after 7 or 8 books and talking to thousands of practitioners?
Well, I think one has to look at it as a comparative politics, because the culture, and one of the key questions I look at relative to other regions and countries is, why are there so many think tanks in the United States? Part of it has to do with when you look at the unique political culture we have, and that sort of flows into the question, answering the question, why are they important? One is that we rely on, and it's from the inception of the Republic, it's not just a Republican mantra, the government that governs best governs least, factions, and de Tocqueville's observation, and that we rely on outside expertise. And for that reason, both in terms of a human resource function, to add to what Anne-Marie has already said, one of the key functions that think tanks play, and a critical function, is a human resource function for government. Unique to the United States, it's really spreading globally because people are seeing the value of what I describe as the revolving door, so that there are people who are in government, they go out of government, and they don't go as they do in other countries to, into a ministry or somewhere. They go into a think tank. And then, interestingly, cycle back into government. Either, and then go back to a think tank, but not necessarily the same think tank, so that there is this circulation within government and think tanks, and then between think tanks. So that's one dimension. The other part is that there is a healthy disdain in terms of the civil service, and I often am asked to speak for embassies, so I have to qualify that there are many very dedicated and bright civil service. But I say, in domestic and foreign audiences, that Americans hold our civil servants relative to other countries just one rung above used car sales people. I mean, there is this disdain. And then I cite a specific example that relates to the Woodrow Wilson Center is the most important, and getting to why think tanks are critical. One of the most important policy questions that we were faced with is, why did 9/11 happen and how could we prevent it in the future? We did not go to a presidential commission. We did not go to members of Congress, and certainly not to the civil service. We went to a group of think tanks. If you look at the 9/11 commission, it is totally populated by individuals who are either on the boards of or are active members or were active members of think tanks. That, to me, is the greatest and clearest statement that in terms of why we rely on external advice relative to other countries where that is not the case. The reality in terms of funding and the composition globally is there is highly diversified bases of support, and since I'm a PAC rat, you look at the figures from 1980s to present, the funding for think tanks has gone up continually every year.
Not enough.
Not enough, but across the board in
Fundraiser
terms
Emory comes out.
of think tanks in Washington. So, and I sort of say in terms of Lincoln, you can fool some of the people some of the time, but you can't fool all the people all the time. If you look at who supports think tanks and relative to other countries, it's highly diversified in terms of corporations, individuals, et cetera, which is one of the great, once again, genius and benefits of think tanks and independence. And their independence. Relative to other regions, it really is not present. There's no revolving door. There's very little independence and a great deal of dependence, even in our closest counterparts in terms of Europe. The principal source of funding is government. And in terms of the developing world, it's government and public and private international donors. That affects, which is a later question, how the institutions operate and their degree of independence. There's certainly a lot of issues and problems with think tanks and the policy community and the dysfunctionality of the policy community in the U.S., but there are great strengths. And I think part of, in terms of what is at the core of this, is basic marketing principles, the success and business principles, which is an anathema, or people don't like to talk about it in the nonprofit sector. And for years, it was like, we don't want to be marketing. We're a think tank. We're supposed to be thinking. The reality is that the world has changed, both in terms of technology and, which most people don't focus on, the funding of think tanks. The dysfunctionality is not just a function of the dysfunctional relationship between Republicans and Democrats in the city. It's really driven by funding, and how think tanks have how the funding of think tanks have changed over time, from general operating support to project support to now very specific targeted funding in most of the cases, which constrains and also directs the money in a way that influences how these institutions operate. So one, we have to be market oriented, and that's how people have responded to that. But the reality is we also have to understand that these institutions have a unique function in our democracy and other countries around the world, and guarding that in terms of this reflection and overly reflecting the dysfunctionality of the political environment in Washington, and the need to sort of step back and say, and I think the real troubling part is becoming part of the solution, not being perceived as part of the problem. So there are all of these elements which are key and cut against it, because the marketing and being effective in terms of marketing means that you're responsive to your audience and market, but the market and audience here may be very dysfunctional, and in some respects, the institutions have to resist that.
Lawrence, tell us about, CGD really is created as an anchor institution in the development field. Lots of people do development. Is there a different function that it has, the Center for Global Development?
I'm going to come to that, but first I want to say congratulations on the book. I wished I'd had it 10 years ago when I left the World Bank and went to work at CGD. And if you're involved in the think tank world and you haven't read it, I urge you to read it. It's a terrific read, so congratulations for that. How many people here work in a think tank or have worked in a think tank? Okay, put your hands down. Is there anybody here who's worked as a reporter or is currently working as a reporter? How many people have done both? Yeah. Journalism is collapsing, and that's created a vacuum in which think tanks have a very different and special role to play. And I was thinking about how Anne-Marie addressed this need for what she calls translation from her standpoint as a former academic and somebody who has also been in government. I haven't done either of those things, but I was a journalist for about 15 years, and I have watched with some alarm as the business models that sustained my work when I was in East Asia have collapsed. And we don't have to look any further than Jeff Bezos' purchase of the Washington Post to know that that process is still unspooling. And that means that, and you've got all these other wonderful things going on with the explosion of new media, but most of them, the good ones, are well-informed opinion writers, and the rest of them are poorly informed opinion writers, and there's very little support for actual hard work of gathering and processing information. And I think that some of the most successful tanks recognize that and have moved into that space, and this is something we've tried to do at CGD, of creating, first of all, the knowledge that needs to underpin the long-form content, but then also the long-form content. And if you'll indulge me, I'll tell you a story that happened just in the past few days. With the terrible news of the typhoon in the Philippines, I was thinking over the weekend, what do we have to say? We do a lot of research on assistance, including humanitarian systems. What could we say about what could be done better or different, or maybe what's being done well in the Philippines? I didn't really have an answer, but when I got to work in the morning, my colleague Owen Barter, who works out of London, in our European office, had pulled together a letter that was going to be published in the Financial Times urging a transparency. That is, that all of the many agencies that are now going to be putting money and assistance of various types into Leyte would, as soon as possible, post in machine-readable format the data about what they're doing and where they're doing it. And this resonates very strongly with work that we've done, because my colleague Vijaya Ramachandran did some work to try to find out what happened to the, I think it's $4 billion that was pumped into Haiti. You can't find out. There is no record. USAID is required to disclose to whom it contracts, but it stops there. And those contractors in turn subcontract to others, and they're required to collect but not publish that information. So for the $3 billion, I know it was $3 billion from the US, there's no record. And if you're on the ground in Haiti, there's 200 to 400,000 people still living in tents. So clearly a lot of that money was sucked up. It's not necessarily corruption in Haiti. My suspicion, although we don't really know, is that it was sucked up by intermediaries, and I hope I don't offend anybody, but Chemonics got one of the largest contracts and has provided no information about what it did with the money. So we have an opportunity in the Philippines to turn that around, and there are now 3 different largely interoperable platforms in which organizations have been pledging to disclose this kind of information in machine-readable format so that people like yourselves could go in and look at it. And even people who are doing work at that time would be able to not overlap as much and to be accountable. We also have some work on biometrics ID, the issuing of unique identification, and how helpful that would have been in the Philippines when people's IDs have all been washed out to sea, to be able to show up, bring in some portable, iris readers or other scan readers like they now have the ability to do in India, and say, yeah, you are who you say you are, and this is your allotment of relief that we're able to provide you. So we had those ideas, but in the course of Monday, we packaged them up. We put them out. I put a headline on it that was a little provocative, but Vij said, let's go with it. Let's not help the Philippines like we helped Haiti. So a little bit of a bait and switch. Sounds like it might not be generous. It went out, and today I found out, and think tanks, why are the fights so fierce? Because the stakes are so small. But we've got 4.6 thousand Facebook likes. For us, that's like huge. It's like totally out of the park. For Anne-Marie, probably this, and not such a big deal. For us, it's like really big. We're very excited about that. And then when I looked at the data, interestingly, it's the Philippine diaspora. We're getting this from the Philippines, from the United States, from the Arab Emirates, from Singapore, from Hong Kong. They're the ones that are driving it. But we've got a point to this, which is we have said there's an opportunity there for USAID to turn from a laggard into a leader pretty quickly by just announcing that it expects all of its contractors to post machine-readable data about their activities in close as possible in real time. So is it journalism? Is it think tank? You know, a journalist would not have done the research that Vidge did. An academic researcher would not have had that platform that we had to turn it into a long-form piece. And I hope I don't jinx it, but we, with a little bit of luck, we've been asked to do a piece for the Washington Post on Sunday. So you may be seeing it in the paper. So that's kind of how we try and bridge things.
Great. Steve.
Brookings is one of the older think tanks in the United States. I don't think we're the oldest. I think Carnegie Endowment stakes the claim for that, and I think we got to give credit where credit is due. But we're approaching our 100th birthday, and we went through a strategic planning process that Andrew writes very generously about in the book a couple of years ago, and we've actually gone through it twice since then. And I know we'll be talking about strategic planning later, at least I think we will. But one of the sayings that we were talking about in our first strategic planning process was we were a venerable institution. The Brookings Institution is a venerable institution. It's been around for 95 years or 92 years at the time. But that's venerable equals vulnerable. We put it on a whiteboard because you cannot rest on your reputation, or reputations are lost just like that. And you must remain on the cutting edge, even if you're 100 years old. Especially if you're 100 years old. And so for Brookings, it has been a process of multiple reinvention over the years. Reinvention that has changed the perception of the Brookings Institution from being sort of conservative to being New Dealers, to being anti-New Dealers, to being progressives, to being not really that progressive, to having Nixon fantasize about bombing us, and there we've stayed for some time. But the reality is that Brookings has tried to be as dynamic as possible, as dynamic and as nimble as a small think tank, which is difficult if you're a big think tank. But it's not impossible, and it's something that we have really strived to do. This gets to why do think tanks matter? That was the question that you asked, Andrew, and I'll try to answer that. Think tanks, they used to matter for different reasons than they matter now. When Robert Brookings came to Washington in 1916, it mattered because he saw a federal workforce that was hopelessly ill-equipped for a United States that was about to enter the Great War. And he was horrified by what he saw, and he felt that think tanks should do. He created an institution that ultimately became actually a couple of institutions that became the Brookings Institution, that was to primarily provide analysis for the federal workforce and to train the federal workforce on how to be better civil servants. So until the 50s, Brookings gave out PhDs, and in fact, there are still some people out there who have Brookings PhDs in economics. We got out of that business, but we still think that educating the federal workforce to a certain extent, the core of that ideal, is still an important piece of think tankery. Brookings has seen the world change and shift, and was number 5 on Andrew's list of things is how do you measure your impact? It's one of these incredibly vexing things, but it gets at the very core of the questions of why do think tanks matter. But for us, if we look back over time, we can see Brookings' fingerprints on a lot of important policy matters out there. But that's very difficult to quantify, and you can't go to the bank with fingerprints on policy. And in this day and age, as Jim said, as the rest of the world looks at Washington, looks at Congress, where a bona fide act of policymaking hasn't happened in some time, in the rest of Washington, policymaking happens every day, as Anne-Marie knows. It happens in the bureaucracy. It has to happen, and so think tanks have to play an important role in feeding the American government really important analysis. So that core piece of our mission, despite how dysfunctional government is or seems to the rest of the world, it goes on, and it's a many billion-dollar enterprise, and it needs help. But the existential threat that Jim referenced of the rest of the world thinks that Washington is hopeless, and think tanks influence Washington, so aren't think tanks hopeless too? That's a very important problem for all of us to grapple with. And so CGD has really pioneered some very important work on global development and working with new partners in other countries and with the international financial institutions. Brookings has done that as well. We've also branched out beyond the federal government and beyond Washington. And in our Metro program, we are working with state and local leaders where acts of policymaking actually do happen. And they look at Brookings and other organizations that are doing similar things, think tanks that are stepping into the state and local breach as being extraordinarily valuable. As we speak, most of our Metro program and the president of Brookings are in Mexico City, looking at helping local leaders in Mexico City think about how to make Mexico, to leverage the natural assets that Mexico City has, especially with its advanced manufacturing hub just north of Mexico City, with connections in the aerospace industry, with Canada and the United States, and building a sort of North American manufacturing hub, with Mexico City as being truly a very important part of that. Now, when most Americans think about Mexico, they think about, heads in a bag and the drug war. And we're trying to help Mexico, and not the Mexican government, but the government of Mexico City change the debate. And I think that's just an anecdote. But that could be repeated a million times over by the work that Anne Marie's organization's doing, the work that CGD is doing, the work that the Wilson Center is doing, and that many of the case studies that Andrew references. So I think think tanks really do matter, but we have to be in the business of constant reinvention.
Let me ask you, thank you. That was a great opening round. Let me ask you, let's do one more round, actually, before we go to the audience. Let's get into a little bit how we do what we do, actually. And I'm going to ask 3 questions in one, and you can take whatever parts of it you want on this, which is, first of all, how do we plan for success? How do we think about being strategic in what we do? In a terrain that is not necessarily known for being strategic, terrain of ideas, lends itself to lots of fuzziness. So how do we do that? Who are our target audiences, and how do we reach them? Is that changing over time? And who does the thinking about this? Who's the intellectual capital of these organizations? And who's the rest of the human capital that actually makes these organizations run, ranging from boards to the person that answers the phone? Who actually puts this together? So whatever part of that you want to answer, not everyone needs to answer everything, but Henry, I want to start with you.
So I'm going to take the last one of those. Who does the thinking? Because New America was founded to incubate a new generation of public intellectuals. We were founded in 1999, and the perception of our founders was that at a time of enormous disruption, as we moved from the late industrial age to the early information age, we didn't have a group of public intellectuals who could analyze these challenges, who understood technology well enough to understand the depth of disruption and what was going to happen. So one of the things that makes us different, and I call us actually a think tank plus, because we are a think tank. We're a platform on which programs sit who think about solutions to public problems and who come up with those solutions and try to implement them as much as possible. That's one part of who we are. But we're also a talent bank, right? We have 10 to 20 brilliant fellows every year who are increasingly current journalists looking for a way out. But if you walk into New America, you'll see on the walls the covers of over 70 fabulous books that have been written by fellows who are at New America, people ranging from Chris Hayes to Rehan Salam. Now, nobody knows that they're New America, and I'd like to change that. But the point being, part of what we do and part of what we think is enormously important is to fund thinkers who are not fully at New America, but who are out there, preferably when they're younger, preferably when we can find them and then launch them. So that's the first part of the answer. The second part is we're partly a technology laboratory. So I have 40 coders sitting upstairs. You walk upstairs to New America, it looks like Silicon Valley. It's this big open room with everybody sitting there making technology, coming up with new software, coming up with a mesh communication system. And I mention that because I think increasingly, in some cases, technology is the answer to public problems. It still has to be technology plus politics, right? Everybody in this town knows that you don't just come up with a technological solution, but for particularly state and local, often in cities or at the state level, coming up with technologies that really work, that do actually answer needs, that's not enough because you still need policy and you need politics, but it's a big part of it. So I would just say going forward, I think the thinkers are not just those people who sit on our platforms in this town, but they are intellectuals who are engaged in either reporting or thinking or inventing or synthesizing all across the country. And they are people that we might never have thought of as part of an infrastructure development, but people who can actually manipulate the intellectual technology of the 21st century, which is often code.
Great. I was asked to look at what are the ingredients for success for think tanks from a major foundation, looking because they wanted to know pre, in process, and post, if they were about to make a major investment, how would they determine whether their investment was successful? So they asked me to interview 125 organizations that were leading think tanks, networks of think tanks, major donors, and who had supported. Surprisingly, when I went and said, well, did you do a pre-assessment of your grant? Very few people did. And then, and most did after the fact, and they couldn't remember where they started, so it was hard to sort of say whether it had an impact or not, but they had to do the evaluation. But the one question I asked is, how did you, across the board, and collected them, what was the principal ingredient for success in terms of an institution? If you were to predict, and then from your experience, what were the most successful institutions? And it really centers, and it's not any grand revelation, but the response was universal: leadership. And in terms of think tanks, it's key. And it's not just in terms of management, because you have a lot of people with ideas. It's easy to lose your way. There's a lot happening, the velocity, and I think one of the key things that Larry said about journalism is very much a fundamental threat to think tanks and all knowledge-based institutions, and that part of the management of those challenges and the velocity of change and the velocity of information directly affects think tanks. So it requires a leader who understands those things, is able to manage them, is able to assemble a staff that is both media savvy, solid scholarship, and also has a technical dimension, and the things are changing, so the mix of the staff and the nature of the institutions have changed. So historically it was just the Brookings of the world, the sort of academic model versus the consulting model versus the advocacy or marketing model. That's all changed, and now there's the techie model. That requires different staffing patterns, understanding that, and a leadership, both board and president, who understands that and has the respect of their staff and can move them forward, are those institutions, if you look at them, that are successful. And in terms of introducing innovations, everyone, in many respects, looks with envy and disdain with heritage, but it was a major, introduced a new strategy and structure that was responsive to fundamental changes that were taking place here in Washington. And you may not agree with it, but the techie dimension and the culture, if you look at Ed Fulner, what he was as a techie, as a person who was a Hill staffer and knew what the people on the Hill wanted and would read, that they wouldn't read books, that they'll read a couple pages, and designing products, a strategy and a structure to be responsive to that, and to forge that was part of the success of that model. And those models that come in and the ones that are successful are a part about leadership, or a part about that they've developed a successful and responsive model, and they implement that effectively. And in the case of Brookings, part of it is, how do you manage your brand, which is also about leadership and managing that over time in a changing and highly competitive market. I used to say there were 4 mores, or 4 issues, or 4 M's that you need to look at: money, manpower, market, mission, and now it's, in terms of information and management are key to the success of the institution. So managers that know all that, and it's a very difficult thing to have, a president that has all of those pieces. In what the reality is, aside from the institutions that are here, think tanks in the U.S. and around the world are relatively small, 5 to 10 people, in the $5 to $10 million range. So they're not huge organizations, and so that people have to multitask, and you have to assemble a staff if you're going to be successful that have a range of skills, not a single skill set.
Thanks very much. I want to try and answer your very interesting question about who does the thinking about the thinking. And I want to try and stretch those of you in the audience, your minds, and give maybe a sort of a counterintuitive answer. And I want to start, did anybody hear the Radiolab piece on Sunday about emergent properties? About ants and bees and thought?
I didn't hear it, but I know what.
But you're maybe familiar with the idea, and there's actually an essay on CGD website about the application of the idea of emergent properties by Owen Barter about development as an emergent property. An emergent property is something that is not in any one of the components, but comes out of that group in some collective fashion. And we all know that, ants and bees don't necessarily have a plan. And this piece was describing how the individual insects make a series of decisions that adds up to, let's go here, and how they communicate that. And so I've been thinking about think tanks as organisms in which the thinking is an emergent property. And here, Andrew, I'm going to just a little bit contradict your notion of strategy, because I wouldn't want somebody who reads your book to think that CGD has an overarching plan. For individual initiatives, we do indeed try and start with the change we'd like to see and work back from that. But for the organization as a whole, we don't have a strategy. Sometimes people ask us, and in fact, my boss, Nancy Birdsell, is somewhat allergic to strategies. When I first arrived, I said, well, I'm going to write a communication strategy. She said, don't bother. Just do the work. Don't worry about it. And I think that makes it possible to have emergent properties. And what would that mean in the context where instead of cells or ants or bees, you have highly creative, intelligent, independent human beings? You can't really manage those people very much. What you do is you attract them to do the thing they want to do, and then put them in a situation where they can have fun doing it, and provide them with the resources and the guidance and the incentives around that to do the things that you hope that they're going to do. And so that relates a little bit to the story I told about our response to the typhoon, in that we invest upfront very heavily, obviously, in our people, and in the core, the base research around particular policy issues. And then we recognize that in changing policy, sometimes, as with our work on the Advanced Market Commitment, you have a pretty clear idea of where you want to go. Very often, there's a large degree of serendipity. You don't really know what's going to happen, and you need to be ready to respond. And in closing, I would say, and here I might be treading on thin ice in terms of stereotypes, but I actually believe that one of the reasons, to the extent that we have been successful, it's because our founding president is a woman. And her approach has, in my view, been the approach that we associate typically with women and mothers, which is to get really good people, nurture them and support them, and let them go off and do their thing. So, Anne-Marie, I think you're in an excellent position. And if I'd be interested, Jim, if you ever have an opportunity to evaluate this incredible inventory of think tanks that you've assembled in your database, to see if there's a difference in those led by women and led by men. But I think in our case, being founded and led by women has enabled us to have that kind of emergent property where it's, to say that we don't do management would be a stretch, but I think there's a lot of latitude to get good people and give them lots of room to do the thing they do best with clear incentives in terms of the kinds of thing you'd like them to do. You don't just want them to write books, you want them to work for an outcome, you make that clear, but you don't try and then manage too much how they go about it.
Let me touch very briefly on a couple of these themes. To your point, when my boss talks about management of our senior scholars at Brookings, he talks about not herding cats but herding lions, and so it's you're liable to get your arm chewed off if you try that. But to play on your metaphor a little bit. If beekeepers can get good things out of bees, and they're responsible for agriculture and honey and other things. So from a management perspective, I try to view it as you need to handle with care, but it can be done. Let me touch on the first question that you asked. How do you plan for success, right? And one of the things that I'm sure will come up in the Q&A is money, right? And having fungible money to be able to put at emerging issues, right? Because if a Philippine crisis happens and you need to develop some intellectual capital around that, it's very handy for an organization to have unrestricted money that they can put towards building a practice area or enhancing a practice area or doing a quick project on an emerging crisis or an emerging issue. That's not saying chase the news item of the day, but it is saying that for all organizations, big ones and little ones, it helps to be nimble, and to be nimble, it helps to have unrestricted capital, which is what Jim was referring to earlier, that the new philanthropists are very focused on restricting their gift to projects and sometimes micro projects within projects. And that is a challenge for all think tanks and advocacy organizations. As far as the target audiences is concerned, I kind of think it depends on the organization. If you are an issue-specific organization, you refer to one of my favorite issue-specific organizations in here, the Washington Office on Latin America. They will focus on Latin America, and so it's a bit easier to look at your target audience. It's not totally self-evident, but it's a little easier. If you are a partisan organization, it's a little easier to target your audience. If you are a large multidisciplinary organization like the Wilson Center, like New America Foundation, and in some ways like CGD, it is more difficult to figure out who your target audience is. And the fact of the matter is, you have many, many target audiences. But like my previous comment, you have to keep building your audiences and thinking about not just getting more people in the audience, getting more hits on your homepage, getting more followers on Facebook and Twitter, but getting the right followers, right? Getting the right people in the chair, getting the right people to read your blog. That's impact. And it's hard to quantify, but it requires all organizations maybe not to go through annual or semi-annual or frequent navel-gazing exercises or strategic planning, but it does require you to be very thoughtful about how you are packaging up your material.
Can I jump in with a very short story? The right person to read your blog is Anne-Marie. And I was telling her that I owe her a debt of gratitude because early on in the Syria conflict, we have an idea for something we call preemptive contract sanctions, which is to say the United States and other places with important courts would announce that it's an odious regime in Syria. We will not enforce any new contracts that regime signs, for example, to sell oil to China or buy weapons from Russia. We think it's a terrific idea. We haven't sold it yet. But when President Obama gave a speech and said, we're going to use every tool in the toolbox, I thought, we've got a tool. So he produced a video in which my colleague Kim Elliott, who's a sanctions expert, explains that tool. And we pushed it out. And Anne-Marie, bless your heart, tweeted it. And suddenly we started getting calls from within the State Department, within Treasury. Other places picked it up, and so it was really lovely. Thank you very much. But it's also a nice example of getting what you say, Stephen, getting the right people to read. And sometimes you don't know who that person's going to be. You're not sure if she's going to see your stuff or not. Sometimes you're quite sure. It's like, we really need her to do this. But more often, you put it out there with social media and your newsletter, and maybe an angel comes along.
That's great. We're running near the end of an hour. We got 5 minutes, so if it's okay, we're making an executive decision and go 5 minutes over. That gives us time for a lightning round of 3 questions and lightning responses from our very efficient panelists here. So in the back there, I see a hand up, and then Bob over there, and we'll come down here.
Yeah, I'm Charlie Erickson with Hispanic Link News Service in that dying profession of journalists. And my question is, first of all, how diverse ethnically and racially are the organizations that you work for, and how important is it to have that diversity in thinking and in staffing for everybody?
Right. We'll go to Bob Hathaway over there.
Bob Hathaway here at the center. Congratulations, Andrew, and thanks to the 4 panelists for really what's been a very stimulating session. Others not in this room may scoff, but I think people in this room will understand when I say I seem to think I have time to do everything at this think tank other than think. And I would be interested in the views of the panelists on successful strategies to enable thinking amidst a welter of competing demands.
Let's come down here. There was a hand up in front.
Chen Weihua, China Daily. September 11 changed in America and changing certainly American journalism and TV station are more careful about not being labeled un-American, unpatriotic, or terrorist sympathizing. Is that a concern for think tanks? What has changed for think tank after 9/11? I mean, I actually heard pundits talking about they are not allowed to say what they want if they want to keep their job. Thank you.
Was there one more hand up? You were very efficient right there. It was the last hand, and then we'll go back to our great panel here.
Hi, thank you for your insights. Very stimulating. My name is Chester Ang. I used to be with the Carnegie Endowment. And you talked a lot about planning for success. So I was thinking if you could maybe talk about the other side of that coin, planning for failure. And I just think about it in light of 10 years ago, you had the discussion about Iraq. Heritage versus the Center for a New American Century. One is still around, the other isn't. Maybe could you talk about why one is still, why one is still around and the other, is now defunct. Thank you.
Right.
Okay, so quickly. So we are not nearly diverse enough. That's actually something I've just been looking at. And we, particularly, a place called New America needs to reflect the New America, and that is an issue that we will be focusing on. In terms of when to think or how to get people to think, let them work from home. There's just I can't ever get anything done in my office, and academia has understood this for a long time. You've got to be really flexible about where people do and can do their work. I don't see any problem, at least I'm unaware of any censorship of any kind. That's just not really an issue. Planning for failure, I think of that as a slightly different, I have a slightly different take on that, which is, for instance, New America doesn't have an endowment. We were founded for a specific purpose. It's a big purpose. I mean, the transition from the industrial age to the digital age is going to take decades, but it's probably not forever. I mean, and the project for a New American Century, there's a new century. So I actually think we don't want to think about every think tank as a mini university. We don't want to endow them all and have them be anchored. I mean, I don't know where CGD falls on this, but I think it's perfectly possible to have places that say, this is what we're founded to do, this is our mission. Maybe we'll reinvent ourselves and have another mission, but we don't exist just for the sake of existing.
Both, I mean, certainly in the U.S. context, think tanks are not as diverse either in terms of gender, although that's changing. I mean, if you look at this institution, your institution, et cetera.
Stimson Center in the front row.
Stimson, right, exactly. There are more and more women in senior positions. There's greater gender diversity than there is, I think, in terms of race. So I think that's a priority, and one of the big issues is also age.
Yes.
I mean, there is, in terms of a global survey that we've done, that one of the great questions that are raised by the senior people at the institution is, where are the next generation of think tankers going to come from? And there is a major change in terms of the leadership in think tanks in Washington that's occurring gradually, but those people who have been a part of the institution from the inception. So it is a critical moment, and think tanks is a very risky business. I mean, in terms of my prediction, in terms of generally looking at think tanks over time, is that they can survive one or two bad leaders, and then they tank. So it's a very
No pun intended.
yeah, and not in anything
from think to
reference to you,
tank,
but
yes.
I'm just sort of, but it is a fact in terms of where, because donors lose confidence. There's a whole set of reasons. I've gotten this question, the same question, in terms of think tanks in the U.S. Essentially firing staff in terms of their opinions, both in China and here today. Which I found a very interesting question. However, I have never in my 30 years of working seen, there may be one instance where that has occurred, but there's not a general policy in terms of, and great diversity in terms of where there are issues that people are uncomfortable with, maybe at times not as challenging the conventional wisdom, but I have never seen, with few exceptions, individuals fired because they hadn't delivered a report or stated an opinion. Additionally, there is a sense of greater diversity of opinion and staff at these institutions, and there is no isolation from everything that I've studied where individuals from countries or racial groups, whatever, have been isolated and singled out, and that there's no current systematic post 9/11 effort to do that. I mean, I want to be clear about. It's universal. It's come up several times. I'm not quite sure where it is, but I think it needs to be addressed, and that's why I'm, addressing it. But the other part, I think, is the issue in terms of the institutions where they haven't been doing what I think the great promise of think tanks are. One is challenging the conventional wisdom. Second is being institutions that are interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary. I mean, this one thing that we touched on early on is the unique role that think tanks have is that they're not government and they're not universities. And part of the unique role is that they are liberated from what I describe as the tyranny of academic disciplines. Yes. And that the opportunity is to create truly matrix organization, and that is something that is unrealized in terms of think tanks, and part of what they also have to guard against is being too much a part of the conventional wisdom, especially in a town like Washington.
I'm going to take the questions in reverse order, and I'm going to start by apologizing to Chester. I could talk about planning for failure for a long time. I'm happy to do so, but in the interest of time, I'm going to take the other three questions. And the next one comes to Chun-Wei's question about labels. I agree with Jim. I don't think there's a concern about being labeled pro-terrorist, but I do think there's a big problem with the high sense of partisanship that has infected the country, infecting the operation of think tanks. And in particular, if you look at the history of think tanks over time, there was a period when there was a sort of sense that they were mostly in the center, and then you had this real investment on think tanks of the right, and part of their strategy was to call tanks like Brookings liberal. and to pull the whole country to the right by taking centrist institutions and calling them liberal. And I think that that's an alarming situation. We're nonpartisan. We have 2 vice presidents. I'm one of them. My colleague is, we're of different parties. Maybe I shouldn't say which party we're in. We're of different parties. We try very carefully to maintain a nonpartisan approach. I think that's very valuable in terms of what we do. But you do have tanks that are clearly on the left and clearly on the right. And as journalists have less and less time, the more they want to do is label those tanks when they put them forward. And so I think that that's not helpful. But it's not censorship per se. It's a labeling problem. Time to think. In contrast to what Anne-Marie said, my president, Nancy Birdsall, says, we pay for these quarters because we want you to run into each other. I do want you to be here. That said, there's a lot of flexibility. Yeah, part of the time. We have Thursday staff lunches every week. Everybody's expected to be there on Thursday. Most of the senior fellows don't come in at all on Friday. There are varying arrangements. Some of them are working on their own stuff. Some they're working on CGD. So there's a lot of flexibility. It's not only to think, it's also to take care of family matters. We try and be family friendly. Diversity, we skew female, we skew young. I think that's been to our advantage. But I think there's another kind of diversity that's very important. I mean, all our senior staff are PhD. That's the pool that we draw from. We've had a couple of exceptions. There is certainly discipline diversity. It happens in development. It tends to be economics, but I think we would do better if we had more diversity across disciplines. I think institutional background is very important. We tend to have too many people from the World Bank, including me. And so I always say no more people who've worked at the World Bank. We want to have people who've worked at other development institutions. And I think I've covered the 3 questions I said I would.
Let me be very brief here because we are over the overtime.
Not by much,
but on diversity, we all need to do better. There's no question about it. Diversity comes in many forms. At Brookings, we have a vast diversity of thought and from political party. We have fairly decent diversity in gender. We're lousy on racial diversity. We must do better, and we are investing in doing better. But it's hard, and Anne-Marie knows as a former public policy school head, it's hard in academia, it's hard in think tanks, but it is something we're committed to, Brookings, and as well as a bunch of other think tanks who are part of the Think Tank Diversity Consortium. In terms of strategy for enabling thinking amidst the many demands, there's my colleagues here have mentioned a number of good things. I'll add in only the following observations. Communications is a big part of think tankery now. Packaging up your product, be it in a book, in a monograph, in a blog, in a web piece, in a tweet. There's 1,000 different ways to put it out there. Think tanks are investing in communications apparatus. They need to do so more, I think. New America is one of the leading edge organizations. So is Wilson Center on thinking about new ways to get product out there. Brookings is investing in it as well. So in terms of packaging the product and getting it out there, that's one of the things that our scholars spend a lot of time when they're not thinking and doing their real research. That's what they're thinking about. The other thing that they're thinking about a lot of the time is how are they going to fund themselves, and that is the big 100,000-pound gorilla that's in every room when you talk about think tanks. It's the sustainability of the business model, and a lot of the Brookings scholars complain or at least observe that some of their time is spent writing grants, talking to donors, talking to potential donors, and it's enormously time consuming and is not particularly value added to their research. And so it gets back to the unrestricted funding. If you have it, God bless you. That's really great. As far as labeling, my colleagues have said plenty on that. Brookings, as I mentioned, has been labeled as both. We started as being conservative, we then became progressive, we then were conservative again, then now we're progressive, and we have been hauled into a sort of if you ask Republicans, we're liberal. If you ask Democrats, we're sort of middle of the road, milquetoast fence sitters. It sounds like the worst of both worlds. So you can be labeled as a lot of things. But one thing that we don't do is we don't label our scholars as being subpar terrorist or anything like that. That's never been an issue in the United States. And as far as planning for failure, I can only speak from the Brookings perspective, where we're pretty much focused on success.
Yes. This is a good note to end on. Thank you very much to our panel. And we would like to invite you